Glasses from hotel.
Well, I didn't even know it was a thing.
Most of today's class, or quite a bit of today's class, on the final sequence. And what you see about the ways in which it's different from the kind of closure, the kind of satisfaction that you get from the final sequence. So that is
One last, very brief sequence that we want you to look at, or one shot in particular that we want you to look at and talk about a bit. And that comes immediately after the sequence that we looked at the end of yesterday's class, where Kane totally trashes Susan's room, where he's unable to deal with the fact that he's lost something else, that another woman has abandoned him, and that damaged child, as it were, that always been there inside Kane from that initial botched moment of transition into the adult world. Takes over, and he has what looks like a kind of adult tantrum and totally trashes her room. This is a shot of him now coming out of her room, watched with absolute awe and surprised by his entire household staff. And it's another of Wells's very tricksy shots. It's another of Wells's sort of very experimental shots. It's another of Wells's shots that's so obviously asking you, what am I saying here? I'm not just telling you a story. I'm not just saying this man has trashed his wife's room and now he's leaving the house. Why film it like this? What point is Wells making? How does that link thematically to other things we talked about? What's that shot saying, aside from here is the protagonist walking down the mirrored hall? The mirror's on either side, obviously, so you're seeing reflections of his reflection all the way down as far as they go.
I think it reflects on the fact that Kane has lived like multiple lives internally, this life that he remembers before he dies, because his last word was Rosebud. Maybe he's still in this world, and this other world where he's this powerful being who's being praised, but in his Xanadu mansion, but he still doesn't feel like it's a fulfilling life. He has this thing inside him.
Yeah, that's interesting. I like that. You're saying he's a sort of fractured self, that he's never coalesced into a kind of coherent individual, a coherent sense of self. And so we're seeing all these reflected Kanes, but never, as it were, the man himself. And it's quite clever because you sort of think, well, this closest one is the real one. But then the camera comes a bit further over and you realize that that's also a reflection. Anything else? I mean, I think that's a very valid point.
Doesn't it signify the different parts of them coming together?
Well, or not coming together.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I think that sort of picks up from the previous point, a sense of, by the end of the film, we've got all these versions of Kane. And I think that perhaps if we push that a little further is the second point. I mean, the point that was made has to do, in a sense, with the main story, with the with Kane's failure to develop a successful, coherent adult self, with that fractured self, and that fact that he sort of tries to be a different person for everybody. He tries to be all things to all men, and that's why everybody sees him differently. So one person can say he's a fascist and one person can say he's a communist because he's been so different to different people. There's no stable self there that remains the same. There's he wants this person to love him for being this, and that person to love him for being that. So there is this multiple self. But I think you can also then push that a little bit further and link it to the Frame story, to Thompson's quest to find out the truth about Kane, get to the heart of who was the real Kane. And I think it goes back to that shot we saw right at the beginning of the film of the nurse seen through the broken glass of the snow globe, reminding us that we never see Kane whole and clear and as himself. We only ever see him, and here the metaphor is slightly different, mirrored through other people's versions of him. So through the film, it's not just that Kane himself is many people, but we've had many different other people's perspectives on that already fractured being. So the absolute possibility of saying this is the real Kane, firstly because perhaps there is no real Kane, and secondly because we've never encountered him except mirrored in someone else's story, someone else's perception of him, someone who loves him, someone who's angry with him. And so we never get anything except multiple reflections of Kane through the film. You've noticed this before, but it's quite nice that he goes out of the shot, and the shot stays on the empty mirrors, as it were. There's nothing there, really.
The other thing that I would want to add is that, again, thinking about this contrast between this film and classic Hollywood films. By the end of Casablanca, which has obviously been our example of a good classic Hollywood film, you feel as though you've been on a journey with these people, you know where they've arrived, and by the end of it you've gone through their thought patterns with them and reached their conclusions with them, and then the film obviously wants you to endorse them. It wants you to feel, yes, this is the right thing for them to do. We understand how they have now positioned themselves in their world, and we are invited to agree with that position, and that is that they must sacrifice their loves, and Ilsa must go to America, and Rick must carry on the struggle against fascism by joining the Free French Army. And you get to this kind of conclusion. That's where it's at. That's the end point.
That's where they're at, yes.
That's where they're at. Here, in this film, we have two stories. We have the story of Kane himself, and we have the frame narrative. Now, this is the end of the story of Kane himself. And you could hardly think of someone imagining a more contrary image of the main character than the one we've just seen. Not a single person who has arrived at a single point who we know now who he is, what he stands for, and so on. In fact, it's an image that tells us how little we know about that, not because we are particularly ignorant, but because, mainly for me, because he doesn't have any kind of interior core. As Jill said, it's particularly what he wants to do. He wants to be loved. He's perpetually trying to fill this hollow in his life that comes from that early transition. And he does it in a range of ways. He does it through collecting things, finding objects. It's as if he could somehow find something that will fill that hole inside him. And he also does it by being different things to different people. In the end, he emerges, if you like, as someone without any kind of principle. All he follows is, I want you to love me. If that means I must be like this, I'll be like this. If that means I must be like that, I'll be like that.
Or I want you to hate me, like that with Thatcher.
Or,
It's sort of,
or yes,
I want to be this to you.
yes, okay, or the opposite in that sense, yes. So we get this ending of the internal story, the story of Kane, without any strong sense of what he's like as a character. Now that moves us on to the ending of the frame story. So I don't know whether you want to introduce that, Phil, or...
Well, it's after Kane's death. They're trying to start clearing all the stuff out of Xanadu, except that there's more stuff there than you could clear in a lifetime. And the reporters are all gathered there, and they talk to Jerry, the guy, Jerry Thompson, the guy who has been tasked with finding out what Rosebud is. And he has, of course, failed to discover that. None of the people that he's interviewed are able to tell him what the significance of that word Rosebud. So he ends his story with no closure at all. He ends his story without finding the thing that he's looking for. And then, as the sequence goes on, we find out what none of the people in the film ever do, and that is what Rosebud is. But again, let's look at how differently this works, how kind of refuses any real sense of closure, even once we find the missing piece of the jigsaw puzzle, as I said, even once we know what this mystery word refers to. It explains a lot, but does it provide the film with closure?
Unwrapped yet? I wonder, you put all this stuff together, palaces, paintings, toys, and everything. What would it spell?
Again, another wonderful example of Wells' very unconventional lighting. He's showing us all these people just as silhouettes. Think again of the end of Casablanca and those wonderful close-ups, those perfectly lit close-ups that show us Rick and Ilsa's faces so that we can read them, so that we can empathize with them. Here, Wells is just not interested in these people as individual characters. This is just the press, prying into Kane's life just as he has pried into so many other people's lives. And so, using this lighting to make the point that I'm not doing the usual thing here. I'm not interested in poor Jerry Thompson who has failed in his quest and how he's feeling. This is a more abstract, if I made the point at all, it's a more abstract point about the intrusive nature of the popular media, which has now kind of come back to haunt the very man who made them what they are.
Okay. Or Rosebud? How about it, Jerry?
What's Rosebud?
That's what he said when he died. Did you ever find out what it means? No, I didn't. What did you find out about him, Jerry? Not much, really. We better get started. What have you been doing all this time? Playing with a jigsaw puzzle?
If you could have found out that Rosebud meant, I bet that would have explained everything.
No, I don't think so. No. Mr. Kane was a man who got everything he wanted and then lost it. Maybe Rosebud was something he couldn't get or something he lost. Anyway, it wouldn't have explained anything.
I was just thinking about this statement which people often regard as an important one in the film about a man who got everything he wanted and then lost it. And it doesn't really make much sense. He never got everything he wanted. He could never get what he really wanted, is one of the points we can make. So it's a little bit confusing, and you can't in that sense take what Thompson, who in a way, at least in a superficial way, has been our guide. Like he's been our guide to this life, although he disappears from the scene most of the time. Whenever there's a link, whenever we come back and we go to get a new perspective, it's via Thompson. But Thompson doesn't really know what's going on. He's unable to get clarity on Kane's life.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at all that stuff, it looks as if he managed to get a huge amount of stuff, but none of it was what he really wanted. He never managed to find what he really wanted, and had to buy more and more and more to try to get there.
I don't think any word can explain a man's life. No, I guess Rosebud is just a piece in a jigsaw puzzle. Missing piece. Well, come on, everybody. We'll miss the train.
We begin now a series of dissolves which just give us this kind of sense of how many things Kane has collected in his life. They've made jokes about it. Leland and Bernstein have made jokes about it earlier on in the film, and how he's buying this and he's buying that and so on. And we just get this absolute mass of objects where the deep focus cinematography allows one also to see how much he has obsessively collected, but never been able to do anything with or to gain any satisfaction from.
In fact, never even taken most of it out of its crates.
Out the crates, yeah.
On his way to go and look at some things that were brought from him when his mother died, that were brought from his childhood home, and these are those few little things. And amongst them, although even now we still don't realise its significance, the sled that he was playing on in the snow the day that Thatcher came to take him away.
Throw that jug.
Nobody else in the film ever knows. But does that give us a sense of closure? And if not, why not?
Is it the sense that there's like no hope that anyone else will ever find out
Well, there is that sense of, we find out just at the moment when it gets destroyed, so it's never going to help anyone else to understand Kane. The other thing, of course, is all it does is take us back and make us watch the film over again. Because even now, finding it out at the end of the film, its significance is retrospective, isn't it? It makes you go back and think, all right, so what is so significant about this object? Why did you mention the name of this thing before we died? And you have to go back to the first time that you saw it in the film. You've got to go back to the snow scene, the scene of his severance from his parents, of his difficult or unsuccessful transition from the world of childhood to the world of adulthood. And then it explains a lot. So there's no sense that the film kind of comes to a satisfying close and you can say, okay, that's fine, now I understand, I can stop watching. You've got to go back to the beginning and watch the damn thing again. closer to making sense of that life as a whole.
And then we end with the, in a sense, where we began, which was with the no trespassing, suggesting the extent to which this whole trip has possibly been illegitimate. Should we have gone on it? Have we been trespassing all this time? And who says we've been trespassing? Have we been trespassing because we are trying to find out the details of someone else's life? And we've got no business in knowing that. Are we, in other words, being like the sensationalist press, which tries to force, and as we've seen, Kane himself tries to force people to make confessions, to find out what's happening in their private lives? Have we been doing it illegitimately for that reason? Or is the no trespassing sign, has that been put up by someone else? Has that been put up, if you like, by the guardians of American culture, by the guardians of, if you like, the extreme acquisitiveness that lies at the heart of the kind of it's not the robber barons, because, well, it is to some extent the robber barons, but the extreme wealth of the arch capitalists, what are now called the 1%, as it were. Is it somebody saying, we don't want you to go there, it's none of your business? And is the film trying to diagnose, if you like, what it is that leads to that kind of excessive desire for accumulation, for power, and so on? There have been a number of films. One of them might possibly be an option in the middle exercise, but Scorsese himself has made a film called Howard Hughes, The Aviator, about Howard Hughes, another one of those fabulous American millionaires. Later on, Paul Thomas Anderson makes a film called There Will Be Blood, about someone who becomes a robber baron, becomes an oil magnate, pursuing that idea of what is it that leads to this extensive, unbelievable desire for accumulation. And is it, in fact, rather than an expression of human enterprise, which is how we are often asked to think about it. Man, it's entrepreneurship. It's wonderful. People are doing these wonderful things. Nowadays, of course, in the tech sphere, from our own Mark Shuttleworth all the way through to what's his name in Facebook and so on, and Bill Gates and so on. Or what is it that motivates these people? Is that our model of what it means to be a kind, or to be a human being? Is that what we should be? Is that how we should be? And is this film a kind of diagnosis of a certain hollowness at the heart of people doing that, notwithstanding their wonderful philanthropy? Because after all, you could argue, and I'm not necessarily saying this is the case, but philanthropy for someone like Bill Gates, who does these enormous amounts of good work, or what's his name?
Maybe he wants people to love him.
Yeah, well, exactly. Maybe he wants people to love him. And I mean, what's a few billion here or there when your annual income is 40 billion? You know. In other words, what the no trespassing might be construed as a no trespassing. Hey, this is very un-American. We don't do this in America because we know what is good. We know how. We know what the main motivations for people should be. And that includes, above all, the signals of success, which includes kind of making money and achieving political power so on. So the film can be, in some senses, then I'm suggesting, be read at another level. It can be read as an account of an individual. It can be read in the Rosebud fashion as the way in which it's about someone who has been unable to become a responsible citizen because they haven't made that transition from the world of the child where everything seems to be there for you. They haven't made that transition to something where you recognize a world where you have responsibilities to others and so on. We can read it in that kind of way. And we can read, there are lots of subsections to that sort of reading, how that's related to the yellow press and so on and so forth. But we can also potentially read it as an account of a diagnosis of the American dream, of American culture. Okay.
All right, so that ends that section. So we finished now with the first section, of course, looking at early film, and there's two tendencies in early film. Then we had the classic Hollywood and alternative Hollywood. And now the next thing we really want to talk about is genre. We're starting now to look at what are going to be three very important ways, or three very influential ways in which people have talked about films. And the first of them is to talk about films by grouping them with other films that have similar concerns, have similar plot structures, raise similar thematic issues, and a group of films that is pulled together like that by common context is known as a genre. So one way to talk about a film is to say, how does it relate to other films that are like it? How can I put it in a group and then see how it is similar to and different from other films in that group? And that's what genre studies is. After that, we'll go on to other approaches, including, as we've said, looking at a film not in relation to other films in similar content, but to other films by the same director. That's auteur studies. But what we're going to do in what's left of the class is just start introducing you to the idea of genre. It's probably not unfamiliar already to media students particularly, but just to how it's used in film studies and what's useful about it.
We're going to show the Scorsese first.
Oh, okay.
I don't know.
Maybe we should. Okay, we'll start as we did with the early film. Taking an extract from that Scorsese series, that Scorsese DVD called My Personal Journey to American Film. And I'm going to look at several bits of it because he spends quite a lot of time on genre. He talks about it in general terms, and then he gives a very useful brief history of the Western, and although we're not going to be doing Westerns in the course, it's a wonderfully informative way of seeing how a genre develops over time and changes. And then also a very short introduction to kind of rise of the gangster film. But this is the more general points.
If you haven't got the story, you haven't got anything. Raoul Walsh used to say this. And this is another cardinal rule. The American filmmaker has always been more interested in creating fiction than revealing reality. I mean, early on, the documentary form was discarded or relegated to a marginal status. For better or for worse, a Hollywood director is an entertainer. He's in the business of telling stories. He is therefore saddled with conventions and stereotypes, formulas and cliches. And all these limitations were codified in specific genres. This was the very foundation of the studio system. Audiences loved genre pictures, and the old masters never seemed reluctant to supply them. When John Ford rose in the middle of a tempestuous meeting at the Directors Guild of America in 1950 and introduced himself, this is what he said. He said, "My name is John Ford, and I make westerns." He was not referring to his more honored pictures, such as The Informer, or The Brave So Brave, or How Green Was My Valley, The Quiet Man. I mean, the westerns were what he was most proud of. Or so he may have wanted us to believe. Eventually, film genres would serve to organize assembly line production. Each studio made so many westerns, so many musicals, so many gangster films, and so forth. Edwin S. Porter's The Great Train Robbery. This was one of the first attempts at scripting a story, and fittingly, it was also a western. The first master storyteller of the American screen was D.W. Griffith. His sensibility was steeped in a literary tradition, that of Dickens and Tolstoy, Frank Norris, and Walt Whitman. Yet, while borrowing from 19th century literature, Griffith was forging the new art of the 20th century. He explored the emotional impact of film, and before the outbreak of World War I, he had already delineated nearly every genre, even the gangster film with his short, The Musketeers of Pig Alley.
Any minute now, it may be curtains for Roy Earl.
Genres were never rigid. Creative filmmakers kept stretching their boundaries. This was a classical art, where personal expression was stimulated rather than inhibited by discipline. Take Raoul Walsh, the most gifted apprentice and disciple of Griffith.
What's the idea, you? Get back where you belong.
His strongest films were variations on a few themes and characters. The figure of the sympathetic outlaw, for instance, a rebel in the tradition of Jesse James, inspired him time and again. In High Sierra, you didn't root for the police and the ordinary citizens. You rooted for the gangster. And you knew he was doomed when he became separated from the only person who cared about him, his tarnished angel, Ida Lupino.
Oh, be smart. Just yell up to him. Tell him to put his gun away and come down. Otherwise, we'll get him sure. All right. Go ahead, yeah.
No, I won't.
What's that?
I won't. I tell you.
We'll get him then.
He's gonna die anyway. Rather than put this away. Come on, get him, all of you. Get him, get him.
Come down, Charles!
At the end of his memoirs, Walsh quotes Shakespeare, his constant inspiration. Each man in his time plays many parts. This applies to Walsh himself, but also to his explosive characters. These outcasts were bigger than life. They stood beyond good and evil. Their lust for life was insatiable, even as their actions precipitated their tragic destiny. The world was too small for them, and Walsh would often give them a cosmic battleground. Mount Whitney and the High Sierras. Eight years later, Walsh filmed the same story as a western, Colorado Territory. Again, he provided his desperado with a wide landscape which dwarfed human figures. This time, the City of the Moon and the Canyon of Death.
Hey, McQueen! You got no chance! Come on now! We'll starve you out!
So dear to the heart of Raoul Walsh was his heroine, now a half-breed outcast, that he gave her as much strength and character as the hero.
You don't want to leave him up there. Was it picking his bones clean? Call him out and we'll split the 20,000 reward with you.
You might even sense a mystical dimension at the end of the film that clearly transcended any genre limitation. The lost city is like a primitive cathedral. And as he listens to the Navajos chanting in the night, Joel McCrea reflects on his fate and appears to accept it. Walsh used some of camera angles as in the High Sierra, but this time, the messenger of death was a Navajo sharpshooter. And in Colorado territory, the tragedy was complete. Both protagonists were doomed. Now to me, the most interesting of these classic genres are the indigenous ones. The Western, which was born on the frontier. The gangster film, which was originated on the East Coast cities. And the musical, which was spawned by Broadway. They remind me of jazz. They allowed for endless, increasingly complex, sometimes perverse variations. And when these variations were played by the masters, they reflected the changing times. They gave you fascinating insights into American culture and the American psyche.
Just to pick up on a couple of things that Scorsese said, to underline them. He starts by saying, well, if you're making genre films, you are, the word he uses, saddled with certain expectations, certain conventions, a set of potential stereotypes and conventions and plot structures. But he goes on to suggest that that's not a limitation at all. Firstly, I think because the implication is that if you find a story that is strong enough, if you find a story that's archetypal enough or that speaks powerfully enough to deep problems in culture or to things that people are deeply invested in, you can tell that story over and over and over again in different ways, and people will never get tired of it. Which is why Welsh could make almost the same film. Once as a gangster movie, Humphrey Bogart, I don't know if you recognized him. Once as a western with Joel McCrea, because the story is so archetypal, so powerful that it didn't matter that you sort of, as it were, seen it once before. You're seeing it again, you're seeing it differently. And then I like his image that it's like jazz, that you can take the same tune and you can riff on it in endless different ways. You can play endless different variations on what might be on its own a fairly simple little melody. So the point about genre is that people tend to think, oh, well, how can genre films be interesting because you're more or less doing the same thing over and over again. But you're not. You're doing the same thing differently each time. You're finding new ways to cover that material, to come at the story, to convey those ideas. And so that's actually what makes them work rather than what makes them not work, is that sense that this is familiar material, but you're getting a slightly different slant on it. And then, of course, the third point, which isn't something Scorsese specifically says, is that because you have particular expectations of the genre, it's wonderfully effective when a director flouts those expectations or does something that you don't expect in that genre. When we look at the section on the Western, it ends with Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven. And there's a wonderful moment in that when the Eastwood character shoots somebody and somebody else turns around to him and says, "You just shot an unarmed man." And he says laconically, "We should have armed himself." And it comes as a sort of shock, it comes as a shock to people who've watched a lot of traditional Westerns, because one of the most powerful conventions in the Western is that the hero never shoots until the bad guy's drawn his gun. So it's fine to kill someone, but only when you know he's trying to kill you. And you never shoot an unarmed man. And what Eastwood is saying is, what a load of nonsense. That's hardly the way that these desperate people in the Old West behave. But the shock of that moment depends on you having seen a whole lot of other Westerns which simply took it for granted that the protagonist, the hero, will only manage to shoot the villain because he can outdraw him. You'll wait for him to go for his gun and then he'll shoot. This, well, he should have armed himself, is a kind of wonderful turning on its head of an expectation that's been built up over decades of earlier Westerns.
Okay, I think we stop there. Today's film is quite a long one, so I suggest we start 5 minutes early, or we can even start right away if people want to do that. Would you rather start right away? Okay.
Pocket on. Oh, and he wins.